When I agreed to that weekend drive with Roger and his friend, I thought it was just a simple outing, a chance to break up the monotony of my carefully managed life. How harmless it seemed at the time to indulge Roger's persistent request to meet Jack. After all, I was just a stepmom, married to Roger's father for only a few years. And Leonard wasn't around much anyway, always jetting off for work, leaving me to play the role of devoted wife in his absence. So when Roger's text came, inviting me along for a little adventure, I shrugged off the initial hesitations and said yes. I had no idea what the next 48 hours would hold. The things I would do, the things I would learn, about Roger, about Jack, and most unsettling of all, about myself. Looking back now, I realize that this story isn't one that can be neatly explained. But for the curious among you, here's where it all began. The sun was setting behind the hills when I got the text. I had just poured myself a glass of wine, ready to settle in for another quiet evening in that big, lonely house. Leonard was away again. Another trip to the West Coast for some project that demanded his attention. I'd stopped questioning his work schedule a long time ago. Some things were just easier left unasked. "Hey Martha, want to come out for a drive tomorrow?" It was Roger. Even though he was Leonard's son from his first marriage, he had this habit of texting me as if I were his friend, not his stepmother. I set down my glass, a little surprised by the invitation. Roger and I had always gotten along well enough, though we kept our relationship mostly polite, at a safe distance. He was 28, independent, still young enough to be constantly out with friends, but grounded enough to be reliable, responsible, and even a little charming. "Just a drive?" I texted back, feigning indifference. "Yeah, thought you might want to meet my friend Jack. You've been asking about him," he replied, with a winking emoji. The truth was, I had asked about Jack once, in passing, out of pure curiosity. Roger mentioned him often, always with a kind of reverence. Jack this, Jack that. It was clear that this man held a special place in Roger's life, though I hadn't realized Roger took my interest seriously. It was just a question, really. But there was no denying that a tiny spark of curiosity had lingered after he told me about Jack's looks, his charm, his way with people. The invitation sounded innocent enough, so I replied with a simple, "Sure, why not?" The next afternoon, I found myself seated in the back of Roger's car, with Jack beside me. Roger, the dutiful driver, adjusted the rearview mirror as we pulled out of my driveway, casting an amused glance back at me and his friend. I wasn't sure what I'd expected Jack to look like, but he certainly had a presence. Tall, with dark hair that fell carelessly across his forehead, and a slight smirk that suggested he found the world and everyone in it rather amusing. As we drove out of the neighborhood, Jack leaned back, stretching his arm along the back of the seat. He didn't say much at first, just offered a small smile and a quiet, "Nice to finally meet you, Martha. Roger's been telling me all about you." "Oh, really?" I replied, feeling an odd rush of self-consciousness. It was rare that anyone spoke of me with such focus or interest. Roger gave a small, knowing grin in the rearview mirror, but kept his attention on the road. "So, Jack," I said, trying to ignore the subtle warmth of his arm, stretched just behind me. "Roger makes you sound like quite the enigma." Jack let out a low chuckle. "Only an enigma to those who don't know me, I suppose. To Roger, I'm just the guy who still owes him $20. Roger laughed from the front. "If I kept track of all the money you owe me, Jack, we'd never be friends." I smiled at their banter, though I could sense a slight tension in Jack's voice, an intensity that felt at odds with his casual demeanor. As we wound through the rolling hills and out onto a country road, Jack's hand drifted down to rest on his knee, but every so often I could feel his fingers graze my shoulder. Just a touch. Nothing overt or inappropriate, but enough to keep my heart rate just a beat faster than usual. After an hour of driving, Roger turned down an unfamiliar, narrow road, seemingly leading deeper into the countryside. Trees stretched above us, creating a tunnel of dappled sunlight. It was quiet, eerily so, with only the hum of the car engine breaking the silence. "Where are we going?" I asked, watching as the road narrowed even more, the trees now pressing in on either side. "Just a little spot Jack and I found once," Roger replied, his tone nonchalant. "Thought you'd enjoy it?" "Sure," I said, trying to keep my tone light, though I felt an odd unease. The car wound down the road until it finally opened to a small, secluded clearing. Roger pulled over, turning off the engine. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Jack shifted beside me, stretching out his legs and turning to face me with that same smirk that never quite reached his eyes. "It's a nice spot, right?" he asked. I nodded, but my attention was already shifting between the two of them. There was something I couldn't quite place, a silent understanding passing between Roger and Jack, as if I were the only one unaware of the plan. "So," Roger began, turning around to look at me fully, his expression serious now. "How's everything going with Dad?" The question took me off guard. "Oh well, he's busy as ever," I replied, trying to downplay any hint of discontent. I knew Roger had noticed Leonard's absences, but I wasn't prepared to open up about the complexities of our marriage. Jack watched me closely, his gaze almost dissecting. "Must be lonely sometimes," he remarked, his voice low and knowing. The words hung in the air, uncomfortably honest. I met his gaze, feeling the sudden intensity of his scrutiny, and felt my composure slipping. There was something in his expression that felt like a challenge, like he was daring me to deny what he'd just said. But Roger interrupted the silence, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. "I guess that's why I invited you along," he said, almost as if to himself. "I didn't think you should be alone today." His words surprised me. Roger had never been one for open sentimentality, and for a moment I wondered if there was more to his invitation than I'd realized. But before I could respond, Jack shifted closer, his gaze never leaving mine, a hint of mischief sparking in his eyes. As the three of us sat there, something unspoken lingered in the air. Jack's hand brushed mine as he leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Martha, Roger's told me a lot about you. Made me curious." I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the remark, but I felt a tension building, a sense that I was teetering on the edge of something I hadn't anticipated. "Curious about what?" I replied, my voice coming out more breathlessly than I'd intended. Jack leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "Curious about how a woman like you, someone clearly capable, ends up married to a man who's hardly ever there." Roger shifted uncomfortably in the front seat, and I could feel the awkwardness settling between us. But Jack seemed undeterred, his focus only sharpening, as though he found the tension exhilarating. "Careful, Jack," Roger muttered, though there was a hint of laughter in his tone. "That's my stepmom you're talking to." But Jack just chuckled. "Oh, I'm being careful, Roger. Very careful." As Jack's words hung in the air, I felt a chill run through me, not from fear, but from the uncanny accuracy of his observation. He was right, of course. Leonard and I had barely seen each other in weeks, and when he was home, his mind was still somewhere else. I'd convinced myself I was content, that a quiet marriage was enough, that I was too old to expect passion or excitement anymore. But as Jack's gaze lingered on me, I couldn't deny the feeling stirring within, a strange mix of intrigue, flattery, and a simmering guilt. I was 52, a stepmother, and yet here I was, feeling like a girl in her 20s, caught off guard by the attentions of a younger, charming man. "Do you always make a habit of being this blunt?" I asked, hoping humor might deflect the growing intensity. Jack's smirk deepened. "Only when it feels warranted." His eyes never left mine, a silent challenge that made my stomach flutter, a thrill I hadn't felt in years. Roger was still looking out the window, his face unreadable, but I felt a tension from him too, as though he were silently willing me to resist, or perhaps daring me to succumb. The car was silent. The only sounds, the faint rustling of leaves outside and the slow, steady breaths filling the space between us. I couldn't look at either of them, suddenly overwhelmed by the realization of my vulnerability and by something darker, an impulse I couldn't entirely suppress. "You're not what I expected, Jack," I murmured, more to myself than to him. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" He replied, his voice softer now with a hint of warmth that made me question if his provocations were genuine interest or merely a test. I shrugged, managing a faint smile. "I haven't decided yet." We spent hours in that car, just talking, though it felt like so much more. The sun was sinking low, casting the forest around us in shades of amber and shadow, as if the world were transforming alongside my own shifting emotions. Jack and Roger took turns steering the conversation, moving from light-hearted anecdotes to subtle, probing questions about my life with Leonard. "Why did you marry him?" Roger asked suddenly, breaking a lull in the conversation. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I hesitated, unsure of what to say. Why had I married Leonard? It had seemed like the right thing at the time, a safe, sensible choice. But even as I tried to summon an answer, I felt Jack's gaze on me, as if he could see through my feigned indifference. "It felt comfortable," I finally replied, hearing how hollow the words sounded in my own ears. "Comfortable," Jack repeated, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Is that what you want? Comfort?" I opened my mouth to protest, to defend my choices, but something stopped me. Deep down, I knew Jack was right. I had married Leonard for comfort, for stability, for the promise of a peaceful life. But was that enough? "What I want is—" I hesitated, the words dying on my lips as I realized I didn't know the answer. What did I want? Was there still a part of me that yearned for something more, something thrilling, something unpredictable? Roger was watching me closely now, a look of understanding in his eyes, as though he, too, sensed the longing I tried so hard to hide. I felt trapped, exposed, my thoughts laid bare between the two of them. And as the silence deepened, so did my shame, mixed with an inexplicable excitement that left me breathless. The peaceful ambiance was broken when we heard a loud clanking sound from beneath the car. Roger cursed under his breath, pulling over to the side of the road. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no other cars in sight, just an endless stretch of trees and a darkening sky. "I think we hit something back there," Roger muttered, climbing out to inspect the damage. Jack followed him, leaving me alone in the back seat. I watched them through the window, their faces shadowed in the twilight as they examined the underside of the car. I could hear snippets of their conversation, hushed and urgent, though I couldn't make out the words. A sense of unease began to creep in, mingling with the remnants of the earlier tension. I felt as though I'd crossed a line, stepped into a world where the rules were different, where the boundaries were blurred. And yet, I couldn't deny the thrill it gave me, the sense of stepping out of my own carefully controlled life and into something unpredictable. Roger and Jack climbed back into the car, their faces grim. "We've got a problem," Roger said, his tone more serious than I'd ever heard. "What kind of problem?" I asked, my heart pounding as I took in their expressions. "Looks like the axle's damaged," Jack replied, casting a worried glance at Roger. "We're not going anywhere tonight." I stared at them, the weight of the situation settling over me. Here I was, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with two men I barely knew, one of whom seemed determined to push me to confront feelings I'd long buried. It should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a strange sense of exhilaration, as though I were teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something that might change everything. As night fell, we made a makeshift camp by the side of the road, gathering sticks for a small fire and sharing the few supplies we had. Roger and Jack sat across from me, their faces flickering in the firelight, and for a moment I felt as though I were in some kind of dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The forest around us was eerily silent, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the low murmur of their voices. "Do you ever wonder what your life would be like if you'd made different choices?" Jack asked suddenly, his eyes fixed on me. The question startled me, and I glanced away, uncertain how to respond. I hadn't allowed myself to think about the what-ifs in years. But sitting there, under the darkening sky with the fire casting shadows on Jack's face, I couldn't help but wonder. "I think we all have regrets," I replied finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, his gaze intense. "Some choices haunt us. Others free us." There was something in his tone, something almost ominous, that made my pulse quicken. It was as though he were speaking in riddles, hinting at secrets I couldn't begin to understand. I felt Roger's eyes on me, too, a quiet, steady gaze that seemed to pierce through my carefully constructed facade. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths and hidden desires. I felt as though I were standing at a precipice, caught between the safety of the familiar and the allure of the unknown. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure which I wanted more. As the night wore on, the conversation grew more intimate, the words flowing freely in the darkness. Roger opened up about his own frustrations, his sense of feeling adrift, caught between the expectations of his family and his own unfulfilled dreams. Jack, too, revealed glimpses of his past, a troubled childhood, a series of failed relationships, a restlessness that had driven him from place to place, searching for something he couldn't name. And then it was my turn. They asked me about my life before Leonard, about the dreams I'd once had, the passions I'd sacrificed for the sake of stability. At first, I resisted, reluctant to reveal the parts of myself I'd kept hidden for so long. But their curiosity was infectious, their interest genuine, and before I knew it, I was confessing things I hadn't even admitted to myself. "I used to think I'd be an artist," I said softly, staring into the fire. "I used to dream about painting, about traveling, about living a life full of adventure. But somewhere along the way I settled. I told myself I was happy, that I didn't need more. But sometimes I wonder what it would be like if I'd chosen differently." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. I could feel their eyes on me, the weight of their sympathy and understanding, and a flicker of something else, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Jack leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe it's not too late," he said quietly. The words sent a shiver down my spine. It was as though he'd spoken directly to my deepest fears and desires, the parts of myself I'd buried beneath years of compromise and resignation. And for the first time, I wondered if he might be right. After Jack's quiet suggestion, "Maybe it's not too late," the air between us felt thick and charged, as if we were standing on the edge of some uncharted territory. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, an all too familiar ache resurfacing, one I'd buried under the quiet rhythms of marriage and stability. I couldn't bring myself to respond, afraid that any word I uttered would betray the reckless thoughts swirling in my mind. I had spent years curating a life that was controlled, predictable, even comfortable. But in that moment, by the dim firelight, with Jack and Roger's steady, unwavering gazes on me, I wondered if comfort was just a trap I'd allowed myself to fall into. "Sometimes," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper, "I feel like I'm watching my own life from the outside, like I'm a stranger to myself." Roger looked at me, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "I get that. Sometimes, I feel like I'm still waiting for my life to actually begin." Jack's gaze softened, the earlier edge of mischief replaced by a quiet understanding. "We all settle in ways we never planned to. But every choice comes with consequences, and sometimes those consequences are exactly what we need to wake up." His words struck a chord within me, touching on a truth I'd avoided acknowledging. For years, I'd told myself that contentment was enough, that the life I'd built with Leonard was all I could reasonably expect. But sitting there, feeling the unspoken pull between the three of us. I began to wonder if I'd traded passion for security, if I'd chosen a life that only half satisfied me. The silence stretched, each of us caught in our own reflections. Roger threw another log onto the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the dark. And for a moment, I felt like one of those sparks, rising briefly, dancing against the shadows before inevitably burning out. Leonard's always been practical, I admitted, my voice barely audible over the crackling fire. He's a good man, reliable, predictable, but sometimes I feel invisible. It was the first time I'd admitted it out loud, even to myself, and the words felt raw, dangerous, as if I'd unleashed something I couldn't control. I stole a glance at Roger and Jack, half expecting pity, but instead I saw understanding, even empathy, reflected in their eyes. Roger looked at me with a kind of gentle sadness. It's hard feeling like that, like you're just part of someone else's life, not your own. Jack's eyes never left mine. So why not change it? He asked softly, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. I swallowed, caught off guard by the intensity of his gaze. Change it. The words hung between us, laden with possibility, temptation, and a lingering fear. Change would mean upheaval. It would mean letting go of the security I'd clung to for so long. But for the first time, I felt that fear give way to something else. Curiosity, a thrill that was as terrifying as it was intoxicating. Jack moved a little closer, his hand resting on the ground beside me, his fingers inches from mine. Sometimes, the hardest part is just admitting what you really want. The fire flickered, casting his face in shadow, but his eyes never left mine, unflinching, daring me to respond. I could feel the weight of his words, the implicit offer they contained, and I knew that whatever answer I gave would change everything. The night grew colder, the fire's warmth barely enough to stave off the chill that settled over us. We huddled closer, sharing what little warmth remained, and I found myself sandwiched between Roger and Jack, their proximity both comforting and electrifying. Roger was quiet, lost in thought, while Jack's gaze remained fixed on me, his presence a steady, unspoken promise. I felt a sudden urge to break the silence, to lighten the tension that had built between us, but every time I opened my mouth, the words escaped me. Finally, Jack leaned in, his voice barely a murmur. "Martha, I think you've been waiting too long." I swallowed, my pulse quickening. "Waiting for what?" "For something real," he replied simply, his tone sincere and almost gentle, as though he could sense the storm raging within me. "For something that feels alive." The honesty in his voice left me breathless, and for a moment I forgot everything else. The years with Leonard, the carefully built life I'd come to accept as mine. All I could feel was the weight of Jack's words, and the aching desire to feel alive again. Roger shifted beside me, his hand brushing mine, a quiet gesture that sent a shiver down my spine. I looked at him, and in his eyes I saw a similar longing, a need for something more. For the first time, I realized that we were all connected by the same unspoken desire, each of us yearning for something that had slipped away, something we'd lost without even realizing it. The quiet moments stretched on, and I found myself lost in thought, caught between the past and the present, between the life I'd built and the one I longed for. Leonard's absence, once a comfort, now felt like a burden, a reminder of all the ways I'd settled. And here, in the darkened woods with Roger and Jack beside me, I felt the weight of that choice more acutely than ever before. Jack's hand reached for mine, his fingers warm and steady. "You don't have to keep living someone else's life," he said softly, his words piercing the silence like a knife. My heart raced, the thrill of his touch mingling with a strange sense of release, a freedom I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. And as I looked into his eyes, I felt a flicker of something long forgotten, a glimmer of hope, a chance to reclaim the parts of myself I'd buried for so long. Roger watched us, his expression unreadable, but I could sense his understanding, his silent support. And in that moment, I made a decision, one that I knew would change everything. The next morning, the three of us packed up the makeshift camp in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Roger and Jack worked in tandem, their movements practiced and efficient, and I felt a pang of gratitude, a sense of camaraderie that went beyond words. I knew that whatever happened next, I wasn't alone. I had a choice, a chance to create something new, to live a life that was truly mine. As we walked back to the car, the weight of my decision settled over me, a mixture of fear and excitement that left me breathless. Jack caught my eye, a small, reassuring smile playing on his lips, and I felt a surge of determination, a newfound resolve that gave me strength. When we finally reached the car, Roger paused, turning to me with a solemn expression. "Martha, whatever you decide, just know that you deserve to be happy." His words, simple yet heartfelt, brought tears to my eyes. For so long, I'd convinced myself that happiness was a luxury I couldn't afford, that it was something reserved for others, for those who hadn't already made their choices. But now, standing beside Roger and Jack, I realized that happiness was something I could choose for myself. Jack squeezed my hand, his touch a silent promise, and I knew that whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it. I had found the courage to break free, to reclaim the life I'd lost, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. As we drove back to the city, I felt a quiet peace settle over me, a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The journey was far from over, but I knew that I had taken the first step, that I had chosen to live a life that was my own. And as the miles passed, I felt a newfound sense of purpose, a clarity that left me feeling stronger, more grounded, and ready to face whatever lay ahead. Roger and Jack remained by my side, their presence a constant reminder of the choices I'd made, of the life I was leaving behind, and the one I was ready to embrace. And as the city skyline came into view, I felt a surge of anticipation, a thrill that left me breathless, as if the world were opening up before me, filled with endless possibilities. For the first time in years, I was free. When you've lived long enough, you think you know the limits of your heart, the boundaries of what you're allowed to feel. Then someone comes along and quietly shatters all of it. For me, that someone was a college boy, a young man who walked into my life unexpectedly and showed me a side of love I thought I'd lost forever. When Ethan walked into my gallery that morning, I didn't think much of it. He was just another bright-eyed college kid, eager to learn about art and the business that surrounds it. I'd seen a dozen like him over the years, interns who stayed a few months, helped arrange exhibitions, and moved on to chase bigger dreams. I didn't expect him to be any different. "Hi, I'm Ethan Collier," he said, his hand outstretched as he introduced himself. He had that polite energy you only find in the very young, self-assured, but with a flicker of nervousness beneath the surface. I shook his hand and gave him a quick smile before moving on to the next task. That was all he was supposed to be to me. A name, a passing face. Nothing more. I was wrong. There was something about Ethan that I noticed almost immediately, though I couldn't put my finger on it at first. He wasn't like most of the interns I'd worked with. There was no air of entitlement, no sense that he was just punching the clock. He was attentive, thoughtful, and curious in a way that felt rare. He listened when I spoke, asked questions that went deeper than surface-level chatter, and never acted like he already had all the answers. The first time I really saw him was during the second week of his internship. I'd given him the task of setting up a new sculpture display while I worked on the lighting in the adjacent gallery room. I expected him to need help or to interrupt me with questions, but he didn't. When I came back, the display was perfect, not just neat and symmetrical, but with a sense of artistry, like he'd understood what the piece needed to shine. "You've got a good eye," I said, genuinely impressed. He smiled a little shyly. "Thanks. I love working with sculpture. It's all about how the light hits it. Right?" I paused, surprised. "Exactly." That was the moment I realized Ethan wasn't just here for a line on his resume. He cared. Over the weeks, we fell into an easy rhythm. Ethan quickly became my go-to for handling delicate tasks or brainstorming ideas for upcoming exhibitions. He was smart, eager, and quietly confident. But more than that, he had a way of making people feel comfortable. Of making me feel comfortable, which was something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't until one particular afternoon that I realized how much I'd started to notice him. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing some paperwork for an upcoming exhibition, when I caught him out of the corner of my eye. He was rearranging some canvases in the storage room, lifting them carefully as though they were made of glass. His sleeves were pushed up, revealing the lean muscles in his arms. His hair was slightly messy, the way it always seemed to be, and his expression was one of quiet focus. I watched him for longer than I should have. When he turned and saw me, I looked away quickly, pretending to be absorbed in my work. My face felt warm, and my stomach did a strange little flip. I told myself it was nothing, just a silly reaction to a handsome young man. But it didn't feel like nothing. As the weeks passed, I began to notice other things about Ethan. The way his laugh filled the room, warm and unself-conscious. The way he always seemed to know when I needed help without me having to ask. The way his eyes lit up when he talked about art, or when he listened to me talk about my own work. It wasn't just his looks that drew me in, though there was no denying he was attractive. It was the way he saw me. For years, I'd felt invisible. My divorce had left me feeling like I was walking through life in a fog, going through the motions without ever really being present. Even when people complimented my work or praised my gallery, it always felt hollow, like they were seeing the surface, not the person beneath. But Ethan saw me. He asked questions that no one else thought to ask. He noticed when I was having a bad day, or when I was proud of something I'd accomplished. He listened, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely cared. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan and I were alone in the gallery, rearranging a few displays for an upcoming exhibit. It was quiet, the kind of peaceful stillness I usually loved, but that day it felt charged. We worked in silence for the most part, but every so often, I'd catch him glancing at me. His gaze wasn't intrusive. It was soft, curious, like he was trying to understand something about me that I couldn't quite figure out myself. At one point, as we were moving a heavy sculpture into place, our hands brushed. It was such a small thing, barely worth noticing, but I felt it like a jolt of electricity. I froze for just a second, my breath catching in my throat. Ethan noticed. He looked at me, his brow furrowing slightly, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "Everything okay?" he asked after a moment. "Fine," I said quickly, stepping back and brushing off my hands. "Let's keep going." He didn't push, but the moment stayed with me. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he smiled when he was excited about something, the way his eyes softened when he talked about his favorite artists, the way he made me feel like I wasn't invisible anymore. I knew it was wrong. Ethan was young, nearly half my age. He deserved someone who could match his energy, someone who was in the same stage of life as him. I wasn't that person. But the more I tried to convince myself of that, the harder it became to ignore the pull I felt toward him. The turning point came a few days later. It was late in the afternoon, and I was finishing up some paperwork in the back office when Ethan knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Do you need any help before I head out?" I looked up at him, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The light from the window caught his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the quiet warmth in his eyes. "No, I'm good," I said finally, forcing myself to look away. He hesitated, then smiled. "All right, see you tomorrow." As he turned to leave, I felt a strange pang of regret. I wanted to call him back, to say something, anything that would make him stay just a little longer. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there in the silence, feeling a weight in my chest that I couldn't explain. By the time I left the gallery that evening, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city. I walked to my car slowly, my thoughts a tangled mess of emotions I didn't want to face. And yet, as much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't deny the truth any longer. Ethan wasn't just another intern to me. He was something more. Sometimes, the heart betrays you before your mind even has a chance to protest. That's how it felt with Ethan, like my emotions had already taken the leap, and I was the one scrambling to catch up. After that quiet Saturday in the gallery, I tried to pretend that nothing had changed. But it had. Something unspoken had slipped into the spaces between us, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't. Ethan seemed to sense it too, though he didn't say anything outright. It was in the way he lingered a little longer when we worked together, or the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. It wasn't overt, but it was there, an invisible thread pulling us closer. One afternoon, I found him in the gallery storage room, cataloging a new shipment of paintings. He looked up when I entered, his face lighting up in a way that made my chest tighten. "Hey," he said, setting the clipboard down. "I was just about to come find you. I wanted to ask what you thought about this piece." He gestured toward a large abstract painting leaning against the wall. It was bold and chaotic, with streaks of red and black slashing across the canvas. I stepped closer, studying it. "It's intense," I said carefully. "Exactly," he replied, his voice brimming with excitement. "It's raw. It makes you feel something, even if you can't explain what it is. That's what I love about it." I turned to look at him, caught off guard by the passion in his voice. His eyes were shining, his enthusiasm infectious. "You really get this stuff, don't you?" I said softly. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I guess I just see things differently." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched, charged with something I couldn't name. I felt his eyes on me, and when I met his gaze, my breath caught. It was just a look, simple, quiet, but it felt like he was peeling back every layer of me, seeing parts of myself I'd kept hidden for years. I broke the moment first, stepping back and clearing my throat. We should figure out where to hang that piece." Ethan nodded, but I could tell he wasn't fooled. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I replayed our conversation in my head, analyzing every word, every glance. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just lonely and reading too much into a harmless moment. But deep down, I knew better. The truth was, Ethan made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. He reminded me of the person I used to be, the woman who laughed easily, who dreamed without limits, who believed in the beauty of life. I hadn't seen her in a long time. The following week, the tension between us continued to grow. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it was there, quiet and insistent, like a song playing softly in the background. There were little moments that stuck with me, like the way Ethan's hand brushed against mine when he handed me a canvas, his touch lingering just a fraction too long. Or the way he smiled at me when I made a joke, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't just attraction, it was the way he saw me, the way he made me feel like I wasn't just a name or a role. One evening, we stayed late at the gallery to prepare for an upcoming exhibit. The air was warm, the quiet hum of the city outside filtering through the open windows. Ethan was adjusting the lighting on one of the sculptures, his brow furrowed in concentration. I watched him for a moment, unable to stop myself. There was something so captivating about him. His ease, his confidence, the way he seemed to move through the world without hesitation. "Laura?" I blinked, startled. He was looking at me now, his head tilted slightly, a faint smile on his lips. "Sorry," I said quickly. "What is it?" "I was just asking if this looks right," he said, gesturing to the sculpture. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening as I stood beside him. He was so close I could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of his cologne filling the air. "It's perfect," I said softly. He turned to look at me, and for a moment neither of us moved. The air between us felt thick, charged with something neither of us dared to name. "Laura," he began, his voice low. I stepped back quickly, my heart pounding. "We should call it a night," I said, forcing a smile. "It's getting late." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, you're right." But as he turned to gather his things, I caught the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning. I told myself I was being foolish. Ethan was young, with his whole life ahead of him. He didn't need someone like me complicating things. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had already shifted. The breaking point came a few days later. It was a slow afternoon at the gallery, and Ethan and I were the only ones there. I was working on a new display, arranging paintings along the wall, when I felt him come up behind me. "Can I help?" he asked, his voice soft. I turned to look at him, my chest tightening. He was standing so close, his expression open and unguarded. "I think I've got it," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't move. "Laura," I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "I know this probably isn't the right time to say this," he said, his voice low and steady, "but I can't keep pretending I don't feel something for you." My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. "Ethan?" "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's complicated, and I know you probably think this is a terrible idea. But I can't ignore it. I can't ignore you." I didn't know what to say. My mind was screaming at me to stop this, to draw a line before it was too late. But my heart was already moving toward him, drawn by a force I couldn't resist. "I feel it too," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Ethan's eyes softened, and for a moment everything else fell away. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady, and I didn't pull away. That night, I left the gallery feeling lighter and more terrified than I'd felt in years. Something between us had shifted, something I couldn't take back. And as much as I tried to tell myself it was a mistake, deep down, I knew I didn't want to stop. The heart is a fragile thing, I knew that better than anyone. After years of carefully guarding myself, of keeping the world at arm's length, I thought I'd become untouchable, immune to feelings that could break me again. But standing in the gallery that night, with Ethan's hand warm against mine and his eyes locked on me, I felt my walls crumble. It wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to let it happen. But it did. The following evening, I stayed late at the gallery. Ethan texted me earlier in the day to ask if he could stop by after hours. He claimed he needed to grab some notes he'd left behind, but I knew better. I could have said no. I could have told him to come back tomorrow during regular hours to keep things professional. But I didn't. When he arrived, the gallery was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the overhead lights. I was sitting at my desk in the back office, pretending to be busy with paperwork. My hands were shaking slightly as I heard the door click shut behind him. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice low and tentative. I looked up, forcing a smile. "Did you find what you needed?" He nodded, stepping closer. "I did. But I think there's something else we need to talk about." My chest tightened. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blouse to keep my hands busy. "Ethan, I don't think this is a good idea." "Why not?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. "You know why," I said, avoiding his gaze. "You're young, and I'm not. This isn't something that can work." Ethan took another step closer, closing the space between us. "You keep saying that like it's a fact, but what if it's not? What if it can work?" His words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. I wanted to believe him, to let myself imagine a world where we could be together without consequences, but the voice in my head wouldn't let me. "It's not that simple," I whispered. "It could be," he said, his voice softening. "If you let it." Before I could respond, he reached out and touched my hand. It was such a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through me, like electricity. "Laura," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know you're scared, I am too. But this, whatever this is between us, it's real. And I don't want to walk away from it without knowing if we have a chance." I looked up at him then, and for the first time I let myself really see him, not just as the bright, talented intern who worked at my gallery, but as a man. A man who made me laugh, who challenged me, who looked at me like I was the most important person in the world. "I don't want to walk away either," I admitted, my voice trembling. Ethan's expression softened and he took another step closer. I could feel the warmth of his body now, the faint scent of his cologne filling the space between us. "Then don't," he said simply. The moment he kissed me, it was like the rest of the world faded away. His lips were soft and warm, hesitant at first, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned into him, letting myself get lost in the feeling of his arms wrapping around me. For the first time in years, I felt alive. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, our breaths mingling in the quiet of the gallery. It wasn't just passion, it was something deeper, something that made my heart ache in the best way. When we finally pulled apart, Ethan rested his forehead against mine, his hands still gently holding my waist. "Tell me this doesn't feel right," he murmured. I couldn't. That night, I let myself be selfish. Ethan and I didn't leave the gallery right away. Instead, we sat together on the old leather couch in the back office, sharing stories and secrets in the dim light of a single lamp. He told me about his childhood, about how he'd fallen in love with art after a middle school teacher took him to a museum for the first time. I told him about my divorce, about the loneliness I'd carried with me ever since. We talked for hours, and with every word, I felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. By the time we finally said goodnight, it was past midnight. Ethan walked me to my car, his hand resting lightly on my lower back. He didn't kiss me again, but the look in his eyes was enough to leave me breathless. The next morning, I woke up with a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd finally opened a door I'd been afraid to touch, but another part of me felt the crushing weight of reality. This wasn't a fairy tale. Ethan and I couldn't exist in a bubble forever. At some point, we'd have to face the world, with all its judgments and consequences. I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him, his smile, his laugh, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the room. I was falling for him. And there was no denying it anymore. That evening, Ethan texted me. "Can I see you tonight?" My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the screen. I knew I should say no, that I should put some distance between us before things got even more complicated, but I didn't want distance. "Come by the gallery at 8, I replied. When he arrived, the gallery was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. I let him in, my heart racing as he stepped inside. Neither of us said a word as we moved toward each other, the silence between us thick with anticipation. When he kissed me again, it was different this time. More certain, more intense. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer as my fingers tangled in his hair. We moved together like we'd been waiting for this moment forever, every touch igniting something I thought I'd lost. In that moment, I didn't care about the consequences. All I cared about was him. Once you cross a line, there's no going back. I thought about that a lot in the days that followed. I told myself I'd stop, that this was just a moment of weakness. But I didn't stop. Instead, I let myself fall. After that night in the gallery, Ethan and I became something more. We didn't label it, didn't talk about what it meant or where it was going. But every stolen glance, every quiet touch told me the truth. I couldn't imagine my life without him anymore. We were careful, at least at first. During the day we kept our distance, slipping back into the rhythm of boss and intern. But when the gallery emptied out and the world fell silent, we found each other. Those moments became the anchor of my days. It didn't matter how chaotic the world felt, how many doubts whispered in the back of my mind. When I was with Ethan, everything else disappeared. One evening, a week after our first kiss, Ethan invited me to his apartment. He lived in a small, modest space near the university, a tiny one-bedroom with mismatched furniture and stacks of art books lining every available surface. "It's not much," he said as I stepped inside, his voice tinged with nervousness. "It's perfect," I replied, and I meant it. There was something so him about the place, unpolished and full of life. We sat on his couch, sharing a bottle of wine as we talked about everything and nothing. He told me about his plans to apply to graduate school, his dreams of traveling to Europe to study the great masters. I listened, enraptured, feeling a warmth in my chest I hadn't felt in years. When he kissed me, it wasn't hurried or desperate. It was slow and deliberate, like he wanted to savor every second. And I let him. That night, I stayed with him. For the first time in years, I felt unguarded, like I could let someone see every part of me, flaws, fears, and all. When the morning sun filtered through the curtains, I woke up in his arms, his breath warm against my neck. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that this could last forever. But reality was never far behind. The next day at the gallery, the world felt sharper, more fragile. Every interaction felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. Ethan tried to keep things normal, but I could see the way his gaze lingered on me when no one else was looking. It thrilled me and terrified me in equal measure. I started to notice the little things, the way the other interns glanced at us when we worked together, the way a client's polite smile lingered just a second too long. It was paranoia, I told myself. No one could possibly know. But the weight of the secret pressed down on me, making it harder to breathe. One weekend, Ethan convinced me to leave the city with him. There's an art fair upstate, he said, his eyes alight with excitement. It's small, but there are some amazing local artists there. I think you'd love it. I hesitated. You don't think people will talk? Laura, he said, taking my hand in his. No one's gonna care. It's just you and me. That's all that matters. I wanted to believe him, so I said yes. The drive upstate was beautiful. Winding roads lined with trees that had just started to change colors, their leaves a kaleidoscope of orange and red. Ethan played music from his phone, a mix of classic rock and indie bands I'd never heard of. Do you always listen to this? I teased, raising an eyebrow as a particularly loud guitar riff filled the car. He grinned. What can I say? I have great taste. We laughed, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The art fair was everything Ethan had promised. Dozens of small booths were scattered across a grassy field, each one filled with paintings, sculptures, and handmade crafts. Ethan and I wandered through the stalls, stopping to admire pieces that caught our attention. He was in his element, chatting easily with the artists and asking thoughtful questions about their work. I couldn't help but smile as I watched him. He had a way of lighting up a room, of making everyone around him feel important. For a few hours it felt like we were just another couple, no secrets, no complications, just two people who cared about each other. But the illusion didn't last. As we stood at one of the booths admiring a series of abstract landscapes, I heard a familiar voice behind me. Laura? I froze, my heart plummeting. When I turned, I saw her. Marcy Allen, one of my oldest friends and a frequent visitor to the gallery. She was standing a few feet away, her expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. Marcy, I said, forcing a smile, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, she replied, her gaze shifting to Ethan, who was standing awkwardly beside me. This is Ethan, I said quickly. He's one of our interns. We thought it'd be good to check out the fair for some inspiration. Marcy raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. Ethan extended a hand, his smile polite. Nice to meet you. You too, Marcy said, though her tone was laced with suspicion. After Marcy walked away, I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. She knows, I whispered, my voice shaking. She doesn't know anything, Ethan said, placing a reassuring hand on my back. Even if she suspects something, what's she going to do? You're allowed to have a life, Laura. But his words did little to calm me. Marcy was well connected in the art community, and I knew how quickly rumors could spread. If she decided to talk, it wouldn't take long for word to reach the wrong people. And then what? That night, back at Ethan's apartment, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with every possible worst-case scenario. Ethan's arm was draped over me, his breath steady and comforting, but even his presence couldn't quiet the storm in my head. I wanted to believe that we could make this work, that the world wouldn't tear us apart. But the doubts were growing louder, and I didn't know how much longer I could ignore them. Secrets have a way of slipping out, no matter how tightly you try to hold them in. I had been fooling myself, thinking that Ethan and I could exist in our little bubble forever. After that encounter with Marcy at the art fair, it was like a clock had started ticking. I spent the next few days bracing myself for the inevitable. At first, nothing seemed to change. Marcy hadn't called or dropped by the gallery, and I told myself that maybe I was overreacting. But there was a tension in the air now, a weight that settled over me every time I walked through the gallery doors. Ethan noticed. You've been quiet lately, he said one afternoon as we worked side by side hanging a new series of paintings. I'm fine, I lied. He gave me a long look, the kind that made me feel like he could see straight through me. Laura, if this is about what happened at the fair. It's not, I cut him off quickly. I just have a lot on my mind. He didn't press me, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. The breaking point came a few days later. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, and I was alone in the gallery, going over invoices at my desk. The sound of the front door opening startled me, and when I looked up, my heart dropped. Marcy. She walked in with the kind of confidence only someone holding a secret can carry, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she approached my desk. Laura, she said with a tight smile, I've been meaning to stop by. I set down my pen, my hands trembling slightly. Marcy, what brings you here? She leaned against the edge of my desk, her eyes narrowing. I wanted to talk to you about something. Something I saw at the art fair. My stomach twisted. What about it? I couldn't help but notice how close you and that intern of yours seemed. Her tone was casual, but the implication was anything but. I forced a laugh, trying to keep my voice steady. Ethan's a hard worker. I wanted to show him the ropes. Marcy tilted her head, her smile sharp. It looked like more than that to me. There it was, the accusation I'd been dreading. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My silence was enough of an answer. Laura, she said softly, leaning closer. I'm not here to judge, but people talk. You know that as well as I do. If you're not careful, this could blow up in your face. That night, I told Ethan what had happened. We were sitting on his couch, the weight of Marcy's words still pressing down on me. Ethan listened quietly, his jaw tightening as I recounted the conversation. She's not going to stay quiet, I said, my voice trembling. It's only a matter of time before everyone knows. Then let them know, Ethan said firmly. I stared at him, stunned. What? I'm not ashamed of us, Laura, he said. And you shouldn't be either. If people want to talk, let them. It doesn't change how I feel about you. His words should have comforted me, but they didn't. All I could think about was how much I had to lose. It's not that simple, I whispered. Ethan reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. It can be if you let it. But it wasn't simple. The rumors started small, just whispers in the art community at first. A knowing glance here, a hushed conversation there. Then came the emails, anonymous messages sent to the gallery's account, filled with thinly veiled accusations. They didn't name Ethan outright, but the implication was clear. You need to end this, Marcy said when she called me a week later, before it ruins you. Her words echoed in my head long after the call ended. The worst came when David, my ex-husband, showed up at the gallery. I hadn't seen him in months, and the sight of him standing in the doorway made my chest tighten. David, I said, forcing a smile. What are you doing here? He didn't return the smile. Instead, he stepped inside, his expression cold. I've been hearing things, Laura. Things about you and some kid who works here. I felt the blood drain from my face. It's none of your business. It is when it affects our family's reputation, he shot back. There is no our family, I said sharply. We've been divorced for 5 years. That doesn't mean people won't associate your actions with me, he said, his voice rising. Do you have any idea how this makes you look? How it makes me look? His words cut deep, not because I cared about his reputation, but because they forced me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. Ethan and I weren't just a secret anymore. We were a scandal waiting to explode. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the glass of wine in my hand. Ethan had called earlier, but I hadn't answered. I didn't know what to say to him. I cared about him more than I could put into words, but caring wasn't enough to shield us from the world. Something had to give. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Every step I took with Ethan brought us closer to a fall I wasn't sure we could survive. I avoided Marcy, ignored David's calls, and tried to focus on the gallery. But the tension was suffocating. Ethan noticed. You're pulling away from me, he said one evening as we sat in his apartment. I'm trying to protect you, I replied. From what? He demanded. From people who don't understand? From your ex-husband and his ego? Laura, none of that matters. What matters is us. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that love could be enough. But doubt had planted its roots deep, and I couldn't shake it. The breaking point came when an email arrived at the gallery. This time addressed directly to me. If you don't end this, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. There was no name, no signature, just a threat hanging over my head like a guillotine. That night, I called Ethan and told him we needed to talk. We met at the gallery after hours, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me as I unlocked the door. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice breaking. Ethan stared at me, his expression a mix of disbelief and hurt. What are you saying? I'm saying it's over, I said, tears streaming down my face. This, us, it's too much. I can't keep pretending that the world won't tear us apart. He stepped closer, his hands trembling as he reached for me. Laura, don't do this. Don't let them win. It's not about them, I whispered. It's about you. You have your whole life ahead of you, Ethan. You don't need someone like me holding you back. "You're not holding me back," he said fiercely. "You're the only person who's ever made me feel alive." His words broke something inside me, but I held firm. "I'm sorry," I said, pulling away. "I love you, but I can't do this." The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Ethan left the gallery, his internship ending abruptly. I didn't see him again, though I thought about him every day. The rumors eventually faded, and life went on. But I felt like I was living in grayscale, the color gone from my world. Then, one day, an envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a single note, written in Ethan's familiar handwriting. "I'll never stop caring about you. Thank you for showing me what love can be." As I read those words, I realized something. Even if our time together was brief, it was real. And that was enough.